Will it be contended that the direct agency of Christ extended over 6 centuries and closed with the Spanish mode of electing bishops? We grant that the lot falling upon Matthias was equivalent to a divine call, but does it not follow that the votes of the disciples were confirmed all the more strongly by the fact? If the appointment of Matthias must be ascribed to the direct interposition of the great head of the church, how clear the inference in favor of the popular right in this passage, when we find him permitting the disciples to select 2, one of whom by his own peculiar act succeeded to the vacant place in the college of the apostles. Again, it is asserted that the disciples did not appoint Joseph and Matthias, and that the election was confined to the 11 apostles. But is it not said, quote, they appointed 2, unquote, and the context clearly shows that by those who did so, the 120 must be understood. Why otherwise did Peter address all the disciples assembled? Look at the whole tenor of the narrative. Quote, Peter stood up in the midst of the disciples, unquote. Quote, they appointed 2, unquote. Quote, they prayed, unquote. Quote, they gave forth their lots, unquote. Quote, and when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all with one accord in one place, unquote. It were a sorry specimen of criticism, truly, to place upon the simple and unambiguous narrative under review a construction so harsh, forced, and unnatural that we could not determine when the pronoun they must be referred to all the disciples or to the apostles exclusively. But we are told that those who were concerned in the election of Matthias constituted only a small portion of the disciples. The number was large when we consider that persecution was lowering on the infant church, and however small, it is sufficient to indicate that the members of the church should be consulted in the selection of its office-bearers. Besides, if such deference was paid to a section of the disciples, is there any reason to suppose that a different course would have been followed by the apostles had all 500 brethren been present, by whom Christ was indeed seen at one time, but of whom many might not be inhabitants of Jerusalem? Another objection against the argument for the popular right of this passage is founded on a mere supposition that all who were present at this meeting of the disciples were church officers. The 70, it is alleged, whom Christ commissioned, were conjoined in this transaction with the disciples, whilst the suffrages of the private members of the church were excluded. A very simple process of addition and subtraction will show that there must have been in the room more than the apostles and the 70, but no evidence can be adduced that any of the 70 were present, and if present, they were not there as members of that short-lived institute which expired with the execution of the mission on which those who belonged to it were dispatched. Still more extraordinary is the argument of our opponents derived from the circumstance that it was an apostle and not an ordinary office-bearer that was in this instance chosen. Who does not see that if the disciples were privileged to vote for an apostle, so much stronger is the proof that the Christian people now are entitled to elect inferior office-bearers, sustaining not a relation to the church at large, but to the congregation over which they are to be appointed? Most absurd of all is the reasoning that the disciples in this instance could not have made a bad choice, and that all whom they might have selected were equally qualified for the office. The statement is untrue, for the ultimate appointment of Matthias by divine intimation proved that one of the number eligible had superior qualifications, and if true, how equitable that the people should choose now, when there may be an inequality, without an absolute defect, of fitness among candidates for the ministry. And lastly, is it objected that if the election of Matthias is an authoritative precedent, the lot should be retained. Be it observed, however, that the disciples nominated and chose the 2 persons, and this is quite sufficient to establish the view for which we contend. It was popular election. So far as human intervention could go, God authorized that it should be employed, but since an apostle required it to have a direct call from God, the lot was used that the divine will might be signified on the matter. The divine and extraordinary nature of the appointment which Matthias in the end received mightily strengthens the argument for popular election. Though God must have beforehand determined the successor of Judas, though he might have given direct and immediate intimation of the object of his choice, the instrumentality of the disciples is put in requisition up to the point at which divine decision and interference were indispensable. Such are the principal objections by which it is attempted to overturn the argument in favor of popular election grounded on this passage. Most of them admit of a crushing retort upon those who urge them. Some of them are based on unsupported assertions. Scarcely any of them merit serious refutation, and the sole reason which justifies the expenditure of time in the consideration of them is that no better method can be devised of exposing the weakness of the cause in support of which they are adduced. And here a footnote. We are not ignorant of a most extraordinary view which has sometimes been sported with reference to the election of Matthias. It has been gravely contended that the whole proceedings of the infant church on that occasion were null and void, since the promise of the Spirit had not yet been fulfilled, that Matthias therefore was unlawfully elected, that the absence of all mention of him in the subsequent history of the church is equivalent to an intimation that he never actually served or was recognized as an apostle, and that Paul was in truth the person who was called of God to fill the station and discharge the duties connected with it, from which Judas by transgression fell. We cannot but regard this theory as a notable instance of the shifts to which men will resort for the sake of serving a purpose or saving a system. How stands the simple fact? On the pages of that volume, every portion of which is given by inspiration and given for our instruction, the election of Matthias is recorded, without one qualifying clause, without one word of abatement, without a single syllable to prevent us from imitating the conduct of the primitive disciples, although that conduct, by the view under consideration, was nothing short of a profane and presumptuous attempt to derange the plans of Jehovah, a reckless interference with matters too high for the church on earth. Reasonings from example of believers, when that example has been stamped with the seal and, quote, consigned to the immortal custody, unquote, of inspiration, are sanctioned by the practice of the apostles in the writings which they have left us. Where is the specialty in the election of Matthias, on account of which the narrative of it must be discarded, as having no bearing upon the management and constitution of the church in the present day? If it must be set aside, although no intimation to this effect has been given us by inspired authority, it would be difficult, might I not say impossible, to vindicate Scriptures from having the charge of having in this instance given utterance to an, quote, uncertain sound, unquote. An examination of the whole transaction in the simple, unhesitating, unqualified manner in which it was recorded might suffice to deter anyone from adopting of the view to which we have adverted, so erroneous in itself and so fraught with dangerous consequences, in the spirit of the parting injunctions of his Lord, and with a solicitude that the sheep should be fed, in beautiful keeping with the thrice told avowal of his love to him. Peter steps forward and counsels the disciples by a regard to the exigencies of the church to choose a successor to Judas. The church unanimously assents to the suggestion, and after a solemn appeal in the name of Christ to the hearer and answerer of prayer, the proceedings are instituted, of which the result was the election of Matthias. Let who will pervert the interesting narrative of Luke and charge the ancient disciples with an unjustifiable impetuosity of procedure, we demand strong grounds for abandoning a view of the transaction recorded, which makes it teem with practical lessons of the highest value, a lesson of attention to ecclesiastical duties from the conduct of Peter, and lessons from the conduct of the rest of the disciples of deference to ecclesiastical rule, unity of sentiment and operation. And since they are immediately afterwards said to have been, quote, all with one accord in one place, unquote, of an utter absence of jealousy at the election of one of their number to the dignity of the apostleship. The benefit of this high example must forsooth be lost to us, because the promise of the Spirit had not yet been realized. Now, there is in this plea a curious oversight, a strange confusion of thought. Are we to be told that these disciples were altogether destitute at this time of spiritual influence? Ample evidence exists respecting some of them, that they had already believed on Jesus, and the exercise in which they were at this period engaged, waiting in prayer and supplication, quote, for the promise of the Father, unquote, affords more than presumption, when all the circumstances of the case are considered, that all of them had received the grace of faith. And, if this be correct, they must have enjoyed spiritual enlightenment, which might be greatly enlarged, but could not be for the first time bestowed on the day of Pentecost. The apostles, too, had already, before the ascension of Christ, made full proof of the miraculous gifts which their Lord had endowed them. Among the blessed results of the advent of the Comforter on the day of Pentecost, the regeneration of the disciples must not be numbered. The addition of thousands to the church, and the increase in number and degree of the gifts and graces of the memberships already within her pale, her marvels sufficient to make that day everlastingly memorable in the annals of Christianity, without resorting to the notion that the disciples could not previously have acted under divine and gracious impulse, when in the election of Matthias they filled up the number of the apostles. The adherents of the crude theory under review must also be reminded of the predicament in which they involve themselves if they persist in the behalf that the acts and proceedings of the church before the Pentecostal outpouring, are without force and of no value as precedents. The change of the Sabbath from the last to the first day of the week is argued from the practice of the primitive disciples. It so happens this practice commenced before the day of Pentecost, John 20, verse 19. We cheerfully make our opponents welcome to the benefit of the reply which we anticipate will be made, to the effect that in this instance, however, the practice in question was confirmed by the conduct of the primitive church after the Comforter had come. A little reflection should satisfy them that this argument and reply, if valid to any extent, is valid to their own discomfiture. Does not the fact on which it is based show that the proceedings of the disciple in electing Matthias, especially when we take into account the parallel election of the deacons, may transmit to us a rule equally binding with that which they have left us in the circumstance that they observe the Sabbath on the first day of the week? Where lies the difference between the two cases, warranting us to view the latter as a standing precedent, whilst the former must be regarded as a serious blunder? As to the subsequent silence of the inspired records respecting Matthias, the reply is obvious and at hand. A like obscurity rests on the history of other apostles, and we cannot say how soon some of them gained the crown of martyrs.